We'll now move to the Q&A session. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be taking questions from journalists in groups of threes.
I'm Patrice Novotny from AFP News Agency. Thank you. Just a question on the temperature, the figure you gave. According to the INDC, you explain in the report that the temperature could rise by an average of 2.6, between an average of 2.6 and 3.5 degrees by 2100. Are these figures totally new and coming from your agency after various calculations? And second, could you elaborate a little bit more on the 4.3 Celsius? What would it mean for, like, let's say, big cities like Paris, London, New York, for example, just to be a little bit more concrete about the consequences?
Yeah, Matthew Carr from Bloomberg News. I had a question that touched on that, actually. I just wanted to get more of an idea of the maths and the science behind I think you've dropped the INDC scenario has a lower temperature gain by 2100 than you previously had. And so I just wanted to get an idea of how you have changed, or why you've changed your forecast there.
Megan Darby, RTCC. Two questions. I wanted to ask about China. You mentioned that emissions fell 1% last year. I wanted to ask about what data sources you're using and how you know they're reliable, since there seem to be some discrepancies between different data sources in China. And the other question is about energy access. I see your bridging scenario doesn't lead to universal energy access. Has the IEA mapped out any scenarios which do? And is that incompatible with achieving the 2C climate goal?
First of all, about our INDC and resulting temperature increase, yes, as far as I know, we are the only organization which look at the energy implications of the INDCs in the world, in such detail, what happens in the energy world. And of course, we look at the implications of energy world and reduction in CO2 emission, and look at the longer term temperature increase. The scientists told us, and the world leaders agreed, that the maximum temperature increase should be 2 degrees Celsius in order to have the chances to meet the 2 degrees target and to be in a planet which is more or less in line with what we have today. So if it is more than 2 degrees, we will have implications. For example, you mentioned Paris, I guess, where the Agence France Presse is headquarters, so is the IEA headquarters, by the way. So we expect, it is working with the scientists, every 2 years heat waves in Paris. Or in other parts of the world, much frequent extreme weather events. We talk about the OECD world here, but one country, I think we will never get a question, so I should mention, part of the world is Africa. The least contribution to climate problem comes from Africa, less than 3%, but the largest impact in terms of droughts, in terms of the extreme weather events, will be in Africa. But in Paris, the heat waves is an important issue. For China, Chinese data is not only a problem for this year, always a problem. We are improving, and we are working closely with the National Bureau of Statistics, and these numbers come from the National Bureau of Statistics. When I say the Chinese data, a big question mark is especially about the coal use, and our numbers show coal use to decline about 1% last year. But there are some other numbers which are around that number, but it will not change the picture, even if you take the most optimistic number, credible number, that the Chinese CO2 emissions did see a downward trend last year. In terms of energy access, we do, if you follow the IEA work, almost 10 years, we are working on a universal energy access work, and what we see is that the universal energy access will not change these trends at all. will have a very, very minor implication. For example, if everybody, 1.2 billion people, have access to electricity, forget the INDCs, forget anything, global CO2 emissions will increase less than 1%, peanuts. Why? Because the amount of electricity which will be consumed in those countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, will be minimal. And second, especially in Africa, most of the access will be through distributed generation and renewable energies. So access is not a hurdle or a barrier in front of the climate change goals. The second question I couldn't note here. What was the second question?
Matthew, maybe you could restate your question.
I think the scenario, the base scenario was for 3.6 by 2100 under your base scenario projections.
Yes.
Now your INDC scenario is saying 2.5.
Yeah.
That's quite a difference. So I'm just wondering if you can describe what the science and maths is behind that difference.
So the difference is that 2.6 is the 2100 and 3.6 is the 2200. This is the biggest difference between that. And 3.5 compares with 3.6. So there's a small, with the INDCs, there's a small decrease in the temperature in 2200. But we shouldn't forget. So you shouldn't compare with 2.6 with 3.6. You should compare 3.5 with 3.6. It's a long-term temperature increase. Okay, so, but I can make it simpler for you. You seem to still debating with the numbers. The impact of the INDCs will be rather small in the very long term, but this is only 15 years of policies. These are only opening the door for bigger changes. So therefore, from this very small decrease of the temperature increase, we shouldn't think that the INDCs will not have important effects. INDCs are, if implemented, they are providing an inertia in the energy sector, in the energy world, giving the right signal to the investors, and this will, this can help to decarbonization of the energy sector, which may end up with more significant reduction in the temperatures.
Yes, Junior Isles with the Energy Industry Times. When you talk about banning the construction of least efficient coal-fired plants, are you talking about banning the building of subcritical plants? And also, you talk about using proven technologies. Are you considering CCS to be a proven technology?
Elaine Mills from Argus Media. I was just wondering the translation of the temperature goal into a greenhouse gas emissions goal. So that will be a collective goal, but then would the IEA also look at what countries need to do in terms of their individual contributions to achieve that goal? And then in terms of the 5-year review and the tracking mechanism, say for instance countries are found not to either keep to their pledges or not be delivering a fair share in terms of their historical responsibility or capability, what can be done to compel those countries to do their fair share? Would something like a mechanism of sanctions, is that something that is feasible and realistic?
Kjetil Alström from Norwegian Business Daily. You said that natural gas will be the only fossil fuel that will increase in your bridge scenario. Is that based on an assumption that it will be possible to use CCS, and to what extent?
First of all, natural gas. What we can see at this moment in Europe, that natural gas is squeezed between renewables on one hand, subsidized, and coal-fired power plants. So it is absolutely critical to do something about that. And that has to do also with how to see to it that there will be CCS with coal-fired power plants. Let's start with that one. And there are quite a few good examples of that already in the world, where now we have a good example in Canada. We have very good technology development in Norway. We have good developments in some other parts of the country. So whatever happens, whatever scenario you choose, CCS needs to be part of that, because we can't do without it. The second thing I would like to make, second comment I would like to make, tracking. This tracking isn't new. The countries all being together in the Clean Energy Ministerial, they have a tracking report every year. What are they doing? And in that tracking report, we can see, well, a few red dots, orange dots, and maybe there is a green dot for renewables, electric vehicles, and CCS in the future. But that means that you have to really put all these ideas and all these proposals into legislation and into regulation. Because if you don't do that, it won't work. Now, bringing that all together to COP21, I think it will be very difficult to come up with a binding agreement on anything, because the differences between the countries are huge. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that we have to do nothing. We have to do a lot of things. And I think our 29 member countries, the 29 member countries of IEA, should be exemplary on this and really do something that is an example of how things can be done. And it also means that the proposals, for instance, in this report, should be implemented by them. Because that would make a difference, also a signal, and would help. And I really do hope that we can find something to that. So tracking is also another reason why tracking is very good, because it makes something visible. It shows what the results are, it shows what people are doing, what countries are doing. So it's very important to have this tracking issue. Whether it will be on everything of the INDCs or just on the energy part of the INDCs, because we are an energy organization. But nevertheless, tracking, making things visible, making results visible is extremely important. And yes, banning the least efficient coal-fired power plants, it's part of the proposal. It was part of the proposal in 2013 as well, because it's absolutely important. But it also means sharing knowledge on best available technology, sharing knowledge on supercritical coal-fired power plant technology, sharing that with those countries who are in need of it, like India, like African countries, like China, and like ASEAN countries.
Yes, with inefficient we mean basically subcritical coal-fired power plants, and we consider CCS to be a proven technology, but of course the economic conditions for CCS is very important to see the higher penetration of CCS. So countries, what they need to do, Pilat's question. Now, we believe that with this report, for each country, we give them a strategy what they need to do in terms of energy. This will bring them to make their fair contribution to the reduction of CO2 emissions and going in the reaching our climate goals. But they need to be determined domestically, internally by those countries who is going to do what. We do not want to give any country any target. It is up to them, and this will be discussed by the UNFCCC, and it is a job of UNFCCC and the negotiators to discuss that. Gas is going to increase even in the absence of CCS, because of course, if CCS is there, it will change the picture. But even in the absence of CCS, we see with the INDCs implemented there, we see an increase of the gas market share in the global energy mix.
Yeah, thank you. Roger Harrabin from BBC News. I just want to push a little harder, if I can, at the issue of CCS. You talked, Maria, about the positive signs from Norway, but excuse me, I've been to that plant in Norway, and they're alarmed that they still only have, or at least from last year, they still only had 2 technologies. It's supposed to be a demonstration plant. They'd hoped for 10 technologies. They've only got 2. They're extremely expensive, and they're despairing that the technology will ever really take off. In Germany, the public will not accept carbon capture and storage. They won't allow CO2 to be stored under their homes. You may think it's irrational, but that's going to be a public response in Germany and perhaps other places too. And I recently interviewed the head of the IPCC's report into carbon capture and storage, whose name escapes me. She's a woman in Berkeley. And she said that it was pretty futile investing large scale in CCS because CCS wasn't 100% efficient in terms of capturing CO2. So in the long term, by mid-century, we wouldn't be able to use CCS anyway, therefore it would just be a bit player. So that's a sort of very long question comment, and I would, just to be cheeky, ask you if you would think it was irrational if a country had really good supplies of onshore wind and wanted to decarbonise its electricity sector.
It's up to them.
Would it be irrational? Would you like to comment on that?
I just wanted to ask, this 5-year review business, which seems to be gaining momentum now, it's clearly a good idea in many ways, but I do wonder how this is likely to work, especially for long-term investments for energy companies, given the trouble that we've had already with the Kyoto Protocol, trying to extend that into the same commitment period, when a lot of people at the beginning of that, back in '97, never foresaw the difficulties in extending that agreement being that difficult. And every 5 years, you do wonder how likely it is to get everyone around the table to renegotiate a new target each time.
My name is Suzal Bello. I write for SciDevNet. I was wondering if you could expand a bit on the idea of not-net economic cost. Because in your presentation you mentioned some solutions that can be achieved quite cheaply, but that's obviously different from zero cost. So I was wondering if you could explain a bit more what are the implications of that.
Mm-hmm. I know the concerns. Of course I do know the concerns. On the other hand, it's very easy to say when you have a lot of onshore wind or offshore wind or solar, I don't need CCS. That's easy. Because, there are two reasons why it's easy. First of all, we have a number of projects up and running, like Canada Boundary Dam. And second, we also have to look into a number of industries. Without CCS, it will be very difficult for cement and steel industries, just to mention two, to really decarbonize their process. So that's another issue. And the third issue I would like to mention is what China is putting emphasis on. It's on CCUS, the usage of CO2. Of course, I know that technology is still in its infancy. But there are already a number of examples, and I can imagine that the country of China not only wants to capture, but also wants to use it and then store the rest. But there's one other thing. When we're talking about CCUS, we forget something, and that is to have less CO2, to decrease the emissions, because then the CCS and the CCUS part will be smaller to deal with. And that's something else that we need to look into. Then about the industries, etc. What we expect, Fatih, but I know that your figures, you are very good at figures, even when our scenarios, our bridge scenario, is completely fulfilled, even then, in 2040, I think, or 2050, 60% of our energy will be based on fossil fuels. So this is something that we have to take into account as well. It's not only about power generation we are talking. We're also talking about the other aspects of the use of energy. So we have to see to it that decarbonization is not only having more renewables, but also having more efficiency, better efficiency, and also having CCS. Because the fossils will be part of our energy mix for many, many decades to come. We expect in general that the whole energy mix, the global energy mix, will still be around 60% based on fossil fuels. So that's why it's imperative to look into decarbonization, but it's imperative also to look into energy efficiency. It's imperative to look into CCS and CCUS.
If I can add a couple of things. First of all, as Maria said, we are hoping to see a legally binding target coming from Paris, but of course challenges are definitely there. And we should be, as IEA, we will do everything that there is a legally binding target comes from Paris, but lots of different challenges are in front of us. Now, again, fossil fuels are very important, and they will be coal, oil, and gas will be with us for many, many years to come. But here, the example of Norway, example of Canada, they are very encouraging. But in order to CCS to have a real impact, it should be with coal, and it should be in China, India, and other countries.
Exactly.
So the problem is there. If we cannot succeed that, then these first encouraging steps will not change the entire picture. And in order to succeed coal use in China, India, and other major coal-consuming countries, we need to have different mechanisms than we have today. So we have to be, I guess, realistic there. The question about our 5 policies and whether or not the countries will do they use them? Yes, they do. Yes, they do, and I can give you many examples from US to Europe, from Europe to India to China and others. And to be honest with you, the more they use them, they understand that once they are implemented, the impact is significant, and I will come to the last question, the cost, the overall cost of the economy is in many cases negligible. There are some wrong steps sometimes to push this technology or that technology in a premature way, but in general, when you look at it, we see many governments in the world are making steps in order to decarbonize the energy system by putting more emphasis on innovation. So this is something that we are going to push. And these 5 policies are, once again, they do not need the discovery of new technologies. They can be done now with the right policies. And these policies are already implemented in different parts of the world with great success. I will link this with the third question, the economic cost. One of the successes for me, what happened in Europe. Let me give you one example from Europe. In the last 10 years in Europe, number of electrical appliances we have at home, television sets, PCs, wash machines, refrigerators, increase at least 3 times on a household basis. But electricity consumption remained the same, because of the very strong labeling policies, the standards for the efficiency put by the European countries. So you do not lose money, your economy is not affected, you put the efficiency, your emissions reduced. What happens is that our policies, coming to the third question, our policies we suggest here, they may in the beginning, we look at all of them, they may in the beginning cost a bit more than the conventional technologies. For example, the less efficient refrigerator may be a bit cheaper than the most efficient refrigerator, but as a result of the savings from the electricity bills, they are paid off, more than paid off. So all of our policies we put in place are looked into. What is the investment cost going there? What does the consumer pay? And what are the returns in terms of saving energy bills as a consumer and as a macroeconomy, as a country? And they have been, those policies are chosen as a result of election of the policies which remain without harming the economic growth, in order to increase the acceptance of our policies by the governments, by the others, because we know that many governments are struggling with the economic growth in many parts of the developed world, in some parts of the developing world where they want to grow. So therefore, it is a bit bold. We underline that they do not harm the economic growth, and it has been discussed, proven, and illustrated in our report.
Chris Hobson from Recharge. Could I ask, there's one energy source you haven't mentioned, and that's nuclear. What is your current view on nuclear new build when we've got Germany and France, particularly now France moving away, but yet the UK persists in giving heavy subsidies to nuclear, which easily outshine anything it's going to give to renewables? Can I have a view on that, please?
Stuart Elliott from Platts. Do you think that a prolonged period of low oil prices, I'm talking 3, 4, 5 years, might mean that oil demand actually continues to grow, and so you won't be able to achieve the target of oil demand peaking and plateauing in 2020?
Finally, Ronan Kavanagh from Energy Intelligence. Kind of on that subject, I mean, you talk about the risk to energy companies, but also the need for fossil fuels for years to come. I'm just wondering, how do you think they can respond to that challenge?
Well, first of all, you mentioned nuclear. Nuclear is part of our scenario, maybe not in the bridge scenario, but it's part of our scenarios. And we expect the share of nuclear power, nuclear energy in power generation to increase to 13% in 2030. And that means 2 percentage points over today's level and 1 percentage point more than in the INDC scenario. And that's due to a lower electricity demand as a result of energy efficiency measures. So definitely, from a global point of view, because that's what we're looking at, nuclear is part of the solution and will be part of the solution. The other question about the lower oil prices, what we can see now, that is that the lower oil prices have an impact on the recovery of the global economy. It's slowly, but it's recovering. I think that's important. And it's also important to realize that the low oil prices really give us an opportunity to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. And we are talking about a lot of money there. And we have very encouraging signs in countries like Indonesia, Mexico, Thailand, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, to mention just a few. And my last remark on the energy companies, the point is that as we expect in 2040, to come back to your question, 60% of global primary energy demand will still be based on fossils. That means that there's room for fossils. On the other hand, what we can see, there is a lot of need for investments in the oil and gas sector, because when you look into all the investments just needed to see to it that you can keep the production flat for the moment, because we have a lot of depleted oil fields between now and 2025. Almost 80%, 80% of all the investment in that sector will go to really replace the depleted and depleting oil and gas fields.
Just to add a few points here. In terms of nuclear, in fact, you are right. In France, in Germany, we see a different picture. But in the developing world, it's, especially in China, it's a different picture as well. Today, about 70 nuclear power plants are under construction, and almost half of them are in China. And what is the implication of that? The implication is the following. The nuclear, one of the challenges of nuclear is the cost of capital is very, very high, the first money you pay. And China, by building a lot of nuclear power plants, so-called learning by doing, bring the cost of the technology down, and as such may well be an important player in the nuclear industry worldwide to export this technology very soon. Because in Europe, what we see, the traditional nuclear technology countries, as you mentioned, France, Germany, and some countries in Asia, since they don't build in nuclear power plants, the opposite of learning by doing is forgetting by not doing, and their cost is remain the same. So China may prove to be an important player there, and nuclear is definitely one of the technologies which could help to reduce the CO2 emissions. With the low oil prices and the efficiency, the important point is the efficiency standards put for cars. It is changing the world. If the oil companies only look at the supply side, I think they may be not seeing the entire picture. Today, which is very new, 4 out of 5 new cars coming in the States are subject to fuel efficiency standards. It was 1 out of 4 15 years ago. Countries are putting efficiency standards which puts pressure, downwards pressure on the oil demand growth. Therefore, low oil prices can only risk those efficiency measures to be not so strong as they are today. But I believe cars and soon trucks will get strong energy efficiency mandatory policies there. And I think the fossil fuels question, Maria already gave a very good answer to that.